This question is often put in terms of whether this religion is within the purview of the state. And to some extent, that's a legitimate way of putting it, but it might be better phrased as whether the state is in the purview of religion.
Yeah.
And to give an analogy, I'd like to go back to the discussion of the Supreme Court and abortion, which you mentioned at the beginning of this interview, because you used the word in describing their position. You used the word. I think you said we can't decide. It's not for us to decide when life begins. Mm-hmm. And that word decide is very important, right, because it frames it already as a matter of decision.
There you go.
I've used this same argument in discussing with sort of the Catholic feminist position about matters of authority in the family and marriage. And people will say, well, I don't know why we have to be, fixated on questions of who's in charge or, who has authority. And my response to that is, well, we don't have to be fixated on it, but it's not so much a matter of choosing to be what to be fixated on as recognizing a reality that doesn't come from you. So that if you're given authority, it's actually a rebellion against authority to disown your own authority, because that authority precisely comes from a higher level.
There you go.
And so that applies in discussions of the family, that to claim one's authority can be an act of humility, or to own it, which is a fascinating word, that word own, which you discuss in a footnote in a really interesting way, which we can't even get into. But I wanted to bring that as an analogy to the discussion of setting one's own limits, because you point out you can't set your own limits, because to recognize limits on your authority is to submit to a limiter. And if you're setting your own limits, then you are claiming yourself as the actual authority in the very moment in which you pretend to disown authority. So for the state to recognize to determine its own limits with regard to religion is actually to usurp authority about what lies beyond its limits. Right. And you make this great analogy to the false modesty of modern science, which claims to limit its own purview about recognizing that which is beyond its limits. And therefore, it's not just recognizing its own sphere, it's obstinately refusing to be informed by what's above it.
Yeah, there you go. That's exactly the point. I mean, I think this is, and it's very interesting. I mean, the connection with science, what goes on in the sphere of science and what goes on in the sphere of politics in the modern era are really illuminate each other. And there's a deeper connection between those than one often recognizes. You mentioned Michael Hamby, one of my colleagues. He's writing quite a bit about this. The sort of collusion between politics and a certain technocratic technocratic view of both politics and nature and science.
Right.
I think that's something that really
which has seen its full flowering and flexing of its limbs in the past couple of years.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's interesting. These might have seemed to be radical arguments. When my father was making them in the 80s, but it's in that at this point we're kind of stating the obvious about so many things. But the idea of competence is a really interesting one. The claim of incompetence according to the liberal model gets interpreted as a kind of abdication of any responsibility. So, to say that you're incompetent in something means that you have you don't respond to it. You have it doesn't concern you. But that's actually, I mean, that's a confused sense of that's an incompetent view of incompetence, in fact. And I mean, I'm not competent to fix cars. Right. So but when I confess that incompetence, what does that imply immediately for any reasonable person? It means that I seek out those who are competent, and I have to make judgment to the best of my ability who's most competent, and entrust myself, to that person. precisely because I'm incompetent. So there's the very confession of incompetence goes along with the recognition of a higher authority. But it seems to me in the political sphere we tend not to see it that way. When the state professes incompetence in matters of religion, there's no deference to a higher authority in the matter, apart from the absolute individual will. And in fact, that, as you say, it's an incompetence that very secretly makes itself the final judge in these matters. According to the model that you just presented there with science.
Right. Yeah, and to put a button on that, just to quote the book again, you say the only way for the state to avoid making itself a religious authority in its service of the common good is to officially recognize the authority of an actual religious body.
Yeah.